Well, thank you for joining us for study 42. Hope you had a nice break over the Christmas period, New Year period. Now, we're back and we're in the Old Testament again, and we're back in the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel, very apt for what's happening in our world. It's an apocalyptic book. It's written in 12 chapters, so if you're going to read it over the week, that would be about 2 chapters a week, well, about 1.8 if you want to be precise. Now, the videos we have for you will run for about 1 hour and 25 minutes, so you might want to get a coffee or before you start, or maybe think about watching it over a couple of sessions. Now, we know about the book of Daniel, probably from your childhood. You know about Daniel and the lion's den. I probably know about Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the fiery furnace. But there's so much more in Daniel, so much more. And it's a very unusual book, but a very, very necessary book to study, that we might know the times and the seasons that we live in. Written in Aramaic, it's a kind of a book that is a bit different in its original language from the other Old Testament books. But however, it's got something to say to you, and we'll just pray that God will bless you as you study the book of Daniel.
The book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power, and so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these two stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final 2 beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is the image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus' empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
The book of Daniel is a mixture of the best known and the least known parts of Scripture, I think. Everybody knows about the lion's den. Most people know about the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and into bed you go or something. And then everybody seems to know about Belshazzar's feast, which was the origin of our phrase, the writing on the wall, meaning the judgment that's coming. It's also very easy to understand and very difficult to understand. There are parts of Daniel that are so straightforward, you need no help from me to read them and get the message. There are other parts that are so obscure that people have wrestled with them for years. There's the question of Daniel's 70 weeks. That's been a happy hunting ground for prophetic students for a long time. There's a lot of the book that is natural and therefore easy to understand. For example, that Daniel was healthier when he kept off red meat and stuck to vegetables and fruit. That's a perfectly natural thing which has become very popular today. There are also a lot of supernatural things that people find very difficult to accept, like the fact that the 3 men cast into a fiery furnace, heated 7 times hotter than usual, and their hair wasn't even singed. And unbelievers say, do you expect me to accept that? A lot of it is familiar to us, displaced persons far from home. I'm afraid that's only too familiar in our modern world. Refugees. But there's a lot that's unfamiliar to us. And Daniel does pose the question, what is the Bible? Is it a human book or a divine book? Same old issue is there. Now, it's written by humans, about humans, as I've said, and therefore many simply treat the Bible as they treat any other books in any other category, as history or literature or religion. But you really can't treat the Bible like that, because it's also a divine book. It's written by God and about God as well. Or at least it's inspired by God, even if men wrote it. And therefore, things that are impossible to man, but are possible to God, figure in so many books of the Bible that you're faced with this whole question. Because only God can do certain things, and only God can say certain things, assuming there is a God. Only God can do miracles. Only God can suspend natural laws, or interfere with natural processes, or intervene in the overriding laws of cause and effect which govern most events on our earth. Or to put it in a word, only God can do signs and wonders, which is a phrase that comes in this book of Daniel specifically. A wonder, the word comes from a Latin word which means something that's wonderful, something that's amazing. Mirus is the Latin word, and that has produced our word miracle, something beyond our comprehension, something amazing. The other thing is that God can only say certain things, and in particular, God can only say things about the future with any authority. Anything man says is a guesstimate. He is speculating, but only God can tell us what's going to happen. And the book of Daniel covers 75 years of Daniel's life, but it covers 440 years of history. And not past history, but future history. In fact, as we get into it, we'll realize that he covers at least 2,400 years of history and sees into the distant future with remarkable accuracy. And that again has puzzled liberal scholars who really can't cope with that. Now, there's been a sea change in people's attitude to miracles and prophecies. They used to be considered as proofs of the inspiration of the Bible. And many apologists for the Christian faith used to say, well, look at the miracles in the Bible and look at the prophecies in the Bible. That's proof that the Bible comes from God. Nowadays, both miracles and prophecies are considered a handicap to proving the truth of the Bible. And it's come to just the opposite. And people say, well, if you'd cut out the miracles and cut out the prophecies, I could really believe the Bible. And instead of helping people to believe it's God's book, it now hinders people in believing it's God's book. That's because we now live in a scientific age. So how do scientific-minded people deal with the miracles and prophecies? Well, the miracles, they treat them as fiction rather than fact, as myths and legends. They may have some historical truth in them, but really should be treated as sagas and not as historical truth. So Daniel in the lion's den is explained away as either the lions had just been fed, or that they didn't eat Daniel because most of him was backbone and the rest was grit. In other words, these stories have no historical value, but have genuine spiritual and moral value. They put Daniel's backbone into you by reading the story. A kind of Aesop's fables or Struwwel Peter. That's how many people treat the miracles of the Bible today, as tales with a moral. And they treat the prophecies as record written afterwards rather than revelation written beforehand. And you'll find many Bible commentaries by modern liberal scholars taking the predictions about the future and saying, well, of course, these belong to much later. They've been put back into the book of Daniel after the event. And as we shall see, chapter 11 of Daniel is the most incredible account of a series of events which took place centuries after Daniel. And I'm going to give you a sheet of secular historical record of what happened centuries later, so that you can read it alongside Daniel 11. There are about 200 specific details in Daniel 11, every one of which happened centuries later. And statistically, the coincidence is incredible. It must either have been written by man afterwards, or it was inspired by God beforehand. You've got to make a choice. Now, the many people who want to treat the miracles and prophecies in this humanistic way, funnily enough, many of them want to keep the Bible. I don't know why. I wish they'd be honest and throw the whole lot away, but why do they want to keep it? Well, they say you can keep it for its moral and spiritual values. It's a good book. Cut out the miraculous, but keep the moral part of it, and we'd all be much better off. In other words, live by the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount, but forget the miracles and forget the prophecies. An awful lot of people think that way. Or, unfortunately, many today dismiss the Bible as misleading and irrelevant. That historically it's a book of lies, and you mustn't therefore be taken in by it. So we get this very ambivalent attitude. Do you know why people are unwilling to accept the miraculous and the prophetic? Because they are unwilling to accept God. I really believe that's the basic reason. They don't want the supernatural side of Scripture, because if they believed it, then they would have to live differently. God is only too real. And they would have to come to terms with that and relate to him. It's interesting, you know, the evidence for the resurrection is so strong, as I've said in my little book on the resurrection. It's so strong that any jury in any court would be totally convinced that it had happened as an event. the events of the eyewitness, the evidence of the eyewitness testimony, plus the circumstantial evidence that points to it, is so strong. It's about 200 times stronger than for the fact that Julius Caesar invaded England in 55 BC. And yet I've never met anybody who questions that Julius Caesar invaded England. They all accept that on far less evidence. Why? Well, because if Jesus rose from the dead, they've got to change their lives. His claims for himself must be true, and therefore his claims on us must also be valid. And you can't ignore Jesus. You can ignore Julius Caesar. You can believe in him without doing anything, but you can't believe in Jesus Christ without changing your whole way of life. There's a built-in reluctance to accept the supernatural dimension of Scripture. It's not just a scientism that believes that we live in a closed universe and that there is no reality other than can be put in a test tube or investigated with instruments. It is largely due to man's reluctance to face the supernatural. Now then, Daniel's book, the first thing that strikes you is that it's in two halves, and that the first half is all miracle and the second half is all prophecy. So we've got a problem. Those who have difficulty with the supernatural really don't know what to do with the book of Daniel. It is the worst book for them in the Bible. So that we have chapters 1 to 6, which are very, very easy to understand and easy to teach in Sunday school, and that's why we know the first 6 chapters backwards, and we've heard the stories ever since we were so high, and why the second half is so difficult, and one that we don't know so well, and is very puzzling when we read it. So let's just, I should have done this in a chart, but let's do it mentally and you can write it down. Chapters 1 to 6, chapters 7 to 12. Let's draw a contrast. Chapters 1 to 6 is mainly miracles. Chapters 7 to 12 is mainly prophecies. Chapters 1 to 6, the first half is written in the third person. Daniel, he. Chapters 7 to 12 are all written in the first person, I, written by Daniel himself. So the first half is about him, and the second half is by him. The first half is what happened during Daniel's life. The second half is what will happen after Daniel's life. And some of it has happened and some of it is yet to happen. But it's all future. So first half is present, second half is future. The most unusual difference between the two, now you'll have to listen carefully to this. You see, we've got 2 equal halves of 6 chapters each. In the first 6, the first chapter is in Hebrew, and the next 5 are in Aramaic, which is the official lingua franca of the time. It was a language that was used everywhere in the ancient world. In the second half, the first chapter is in Aramaic, and the other 5 are in Hebrew again. Now, do you follow that? It's interesting. It tells you where the chapters were meant to be read, who they were directed towards. So that first chapter is Hebrew, then the next 5 are Aramaic, then in the second half the first is Aramaic and the rest are in Hebrew. So you can tell which parts were meant to be read widely by unbelievers and which were meant for the people of God to understand. Follow? But it's not just 2 equal halves, it's more complex than that. Now, let's look at the historical background. Put those back up in a moment. No, I'm leaving them in the way. Let's look at the historical background for a moment. Babylon and back. It's very important to realize that the children of Israel weren't all taken into exile together, and they weren't brought back together. That's an oversimplification. When you read the records carefully, they were taken to Babylon in 3 lots. And they came back in 3 lots. But actually the total number who came back was very, very much smaller than the total who went. And in fact, they left behind them in Babylon a whole Jewish community, which was there until only a few years ago. So that they didn't all come back. not by a long way. And the wise men who followed the star to Bethlehem almost certainly came from the Jewish community that had been left behind, who were looking for the sign of the King of the Jews. So they were not probably Gentiles, as the usual Christmas story makes out. They probably came from Babylon, from the Jewish community. That's just an aside. Now, the 3 deportations, you remember the first in 606 was the top layer of society, the key people, and among them they took the young people, particularly the youth. And among them were 4 young men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Outstanding young men who were being groomed for the Jewish royal house. And those 4 men are the heroes in our book. So Daniel went with the first lot among those young people. The second deportation in 597 took Ezekiel. So he followed Daniel. He was a bit younger than Daniel. He followed him. And the rest were all taken in 586. And that's when the city and the temple were destroyed. Now, you don't need to remember all this, but it's just, we tend to get the impression that all the nation went into exile and all the nation came back, don't we? And that's not actually the case. But Daniel was one of the first, and he never came back. Never saw his land again. And he was only a teenager when he went. When they came back later, the book of Daniel is set against the background of going to Babylon and coming back from Babylon. It's all there. Daniel never came back. He stayed and he died there. He could have come back in any of the 3 returns, but he didn't. The first return was in 536 under Zerubbabel, and it was made possible because Babylon was defeated by the Persians in 539. And Cyrus, the ruler of the Persians, allowed that return, and some 50,000 came back in the first wave. The first aliyah, as they call it, that is a Hebrew word for going up to Jerusalem. They still talk about making your aliyah. And the first aliyah, 50,000, was under Zerubbabel. The second came a few years later, under Ezra, in 458. And the temple had begun to be rebuilt in 516, but it languished for a long time. And finally, the last great wave of Aliyah from Babylon was 445 or 444. It's a little difficult working out the calendar, under Nehemiah. And that's when the city walls were rebuilt and the city of God made secure from its enemies around. The other thing I want to point out on this historical background is that Esther comes in here, and she was in Susa, which was the capital of the Medo-Persians. And we're going to study her next. But we're concerned at the moment with Daniel, who lived through all this, was taken there in the first deportation, and stayed even after the last return. He had a long lifespan, and interestingly enough, he was popular under various successive conquerors. They all recognized Daniel's quality. And as each empire was defeated by someone else, they kept Daniel on because he was such a good guy. It's an amazing career. And the quality of the man just shines through. So that's the historical background. The main emperor of Babylon, of course, who did all this was Nebuchadnezzar. And if you've ever seen the operetta Nabucco, have you? That's a magnificent portrayal of these events in Babylon. Right, that gives you the historical background. Now, Daniel's life, which is covered by chapters 1 to 6 of his book. Chapter 1 is about his deportation in 605, 606, and his selection for the royal court of Babylon. It's very interesting that he was given a Babylonian name after a Babylonian god. He was called Belteshazzar. And so were his 3 companions, and they didn't object to that. Find that interesting. They're quite happy to be called anything they liked. but they remained faithful to their God. And the crisis arose because they were being fed to be nice and fat. And that was considered good in that court, as it is today in Tonga. If you've ever seen the royal family of Tonga, you know that certain royal courts consider that a sign of prosperity. And so they were being fattened up for senior positions. And Daniel and his 3 friends did not accept that. And the man in charge of their training at the University of Babylon, they were being given all the wisdom of Babylon, they were being given every educational advantage. He said, look, the emperor will have my head off if I don't fatten you up properly. And Daniel made a bargain with that man. He said, look, we'll go on diet for 10 days and we'll eat what God tells us, and then you can compare us with the other students. And if we are not fitter and healthier, then we'll go on to your diet. Very interesting. How Daniel began his stand for principle in a very small matter of diet. That's the Daniel who could face the lions later. And there's a profound lesson here, that if you can stand your ground over a little issue, you're likely to stand your ground over a big issue. I once said to a saint of God, I'm not sure that I would go to the lions for Jesus if it really came to the push. I don't know if I've got martyr stuff in me. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, David, if you're faithful in little things, God will give you grace when the big test comes. And you'll be all right. And here's the profound lesson. You form your character in small decisions on little issues. And that enables you later, when the big crunch comes, not to shift. It's people who are shifty on little things who fall when the big test of character comes. See? This is the kind of lesson you can learn from Daniel. And they were not only better in health, it says they were 10 times better in their studies than the other students. I would to God that every Christian student in university was like that. See? They're sometimes too busy in the Christian Union. But if they're in the will of God in being at university, then the best thing they can do for the Lord is to be good at their studies and be better than everybody else at their studies. Do you see? That's Daniel. This is a young man with real character, and he's laying a foundation for a lifetime of service outside the people of God. He's going to be in what some would call a secular job. Actually, there's no job secular to a person who belongs to God. Everything is a sacred vocation. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins the rather mysterious part of the book, with a dream of a monster. And that's the only part in the first 6 chapters that puzzles people, because it begins the apocalyptic part, the visionary, the symbolic part. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he sends for all his wise men, and he says, I want you to tell me the meaning of the dream, but I've forgotten the dream. And he says, off with your heads if you don't tell me not only the meaning of the dream, but what the dream was all about, because I've forgotten it. Now, there's a real test, isn't there? And Daniel and his 3 young men could not only interpret the dream, they could recount it. And they told him what he dreamt. Yeah, that's what I dreamt. And they told him the meaning too. Wisdom from God was needed, because how do you know what another guy's dreamt about when he can't remember? God knew. God knows everything. And the dream was of a monster, a giant. And as you go down the giant, so the quality of the material declines from gold to silver to iron to feet of clay. Have you heard that phrase? Feet of clay, or feet of iron mixed with clay. And the interpretation of the dream is that this golden head is Nebuchadnezzar. But this whole figure is an unveiling, an apocalyptic unveiling of future empires that will replace Babylon. Babylon will be replaced by the Medes and the Persians under Cyrus and Darius. And that happened. but they were not the same grandeur or glory as Babylon. Nothing has touched Babylon since for sheer magnificence. They would be followed by the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, who would obliterate the Persians and the Medes. Alexander the Great got as far as India. He built his capital Persepolis right where the Medo-Persians had been. And the ruins of it you can see today. And the Greeks would be replaced with the Romans, legs of iron, and really what a symbol of Rome that is. It was their armies that established Roman law and order. They would be followed by feet of mixed clay and iron. Now I'll come back to all this later, because we've got somehow to fit all this in. And then he saw a stone taken from a mountain, a stone that was not shaped by man. No, I'm rushing ahead to chapter 7. I think I'll leave it till chapter 7. That was the dream and the interpretation. It's the only part of the first 6 chapters that is a bit puzzling. It was God's first warning to Nebuchadnezzar, I'm in charge of kingdoms. The whole of Daniel is saying it is God who causes kingdoms to rise and to fall. Kingdoms come and kingdoms go, but it's God who decides when they come and when they go. And history is his story. And God is saying, I will bring these other empires after you. They won't have your magnificence. They will gradually become weaker, humanly speaking, but it's I who do it. In other words, God is saying, mine is the kingdom, not yours. Chapter 3 is the famous story of the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, probably because of this dream, ordered a gigantic statue to be erected 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and covered in gold. Now, when you know that the land of Mesopotamia is as flat as a pancake as far as the eye can see, a statue 90 feet high is pretty impressive. It would dominate the landscape. And he made an order that whenever the band played, everybody had to bow down to this idol. It was a kind of established state religion. And it was a quick way of uniting the empire around one religion. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to. I've always wondered, where was Daniel right now? Why didn't he get caught up in this? But they refused to bow down. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't notice, but I'm afraid somebody told tales on them. And you know the story. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, which was heated 7 times more than usual. And when Nebuchadnezzar, by the way, the people who heated it up and threw them in, they got burned up. It was so hot. But when Nebuchadnezzar peered in through the open mouth of the furnace, he saw 4 people in there. And he said, one is like a son of the gods. That's a literal translation. That's as far as he could interpret it. One is like a son of the gods. And actually the fire burned the ropes off them, but didn't singe their hair. You can believe it if God is real. You couldn't believe it if you don't believe in God, I don't think. But anti-Semitism became a feature of the Babylonian Empire. And it's been the curse all around the world ever since. Chapter 4 is my favorite story in the Old Testament. That must mean I'm a bit perverted, but it's about Nebuchadnezzar's madness. And he calls it a sign and wonder. And through it he was converted to the God of Israel. It's an amazing story. I'll just give you the background to give you a bit of human interest. He married a queen, a very beautiful princess, from up in the mountains of Persia, where Tehran now is. And Tehran is surrounded by forest and mountains. And when she came to the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, she was terribly homesick. I mean, she missed the mountains, she missed the trees, and she missed the wild animals. And she kept crying herself to sleep at night. He said, what's the matter? She said, I'm homesick. Well, what have you not got here that you had back home? Well, we had mountains and trees and wild animals. And he said, right, we'll soon sort that out. He said, I'll build you a mountain here. And he built a mountain of brick, a huge mountain of brick. And then he covered it with trees and shrubs and plants. It became one of the 7 wonders of the world. Tourists flocked to see the hanging gardens of Babylon. And then on the top he put a zoo, a private zoo, and cages with wild animals in. Right, he said, no more crying in the palace. You've got a mountain, you've got a forest, you've got animals. What more do you want? Stop crying. So that was basically the human situation behind this story. Then one day, he's on the roof of his magnificent palace. Oh, I better show you what Babylon looked like in those days. I mean, it really was an enormous city. There it is, stretching as far as the eye can see. And here is the royal compound. And then there was a main thoroughfare. There's Nebuchadnezzar in his chariot with his soldiers marching in through a very famous gate called the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar, Ashtati, the goddess, it's all there. And that Ishtar Gate, well, you better see it. I mean, it was magnificent. Blue glazed tiles, that is the actual gate rebuilt in a museum. And enormous gate. And in these glazed tiles are these griffins and weird and wonderful animals. And I'm sure they lie behind Daniel's visions of animals, as we shall see later, all kinds of animals. By the way, that is the rebuilt arch in Babylon, rebuilt by Saddam Hussein, half size. So you can tell that's the size of people today. That's the new arch that Saddam Hussein has built, but it's half the height of that. So that's Babylon. And the king was walking on the roof of his palace, and he said, "Is not this great Babylon which I have built by my power for my glory? Mine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory." And that's when he had a dream. The dream was of a huge tree that reached the sky, and the animals found shelter under it, and the birds in its branches. And the tree was cut down and bound in iron. And then it began to grow again. And Daniel told him the dream, "Nebuchadnezzar, that's you, that tree. And you're going to be driven out from among men for 7 years until you acknowledge that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." And you know, he forgot all about that. 1 year later, God spoke and said, "Nebuchadnezzar, what I told you is going to happen now." And he went absolutely crazy for 7 years. They had to lock him up in his own zoo. And he ate grass for 7 years, and his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird, just like Howard Hughes in his last days, if you saw pictures of that man. And that's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 7 years, he lifted his eyes to heaven. He said, "God, you're God." And God restored him to his throne, made him greater than before. And then he made a big mistake. He decided to establish the God of Israel. Told everybody they had to bow down to him and forced everybody to worship this God. You don't get worship that way, but nevertheless, that was his conversion. And forever afterwards, he worshipped the God of Israel, who'd driven him mad. He said, "God had to make me mad for 7 years before I came to my senses." It's a hard way to get converted, but what a story. What a story. Great Babylon. And young Daniel there, you see him living in that palace compound, can't you? Chapter 5 is the story of the end of Babylon. Belshazzar has a big feast, and he makes a big mistake. He says, "I know," he said, he wanted to profane holy things. Do you remember that in Leviticus? So he said, "Let's get the holy vessels that we brought from the temple in Jerusalem, and let's use them for an orgy." And that's what he did. They were getting drunk out of the holy vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. And he saw a finger writing on a wall. "Many, many tackle upharsin." What does that mean? When they saw this disembodied finger writing this, they were scared stiff. And Daniel said, "That means you are weighed in the balances and you are found wanting." That very night, the Persians got into Babylon. And Babylon was finished. You realize that Babylon was the Tower of Babel? That's where Babel was, same word. It's where they built the Tower of Babel. They were always building big things up to the sky because it was so flat. Big things reaching up to the heaven were so impressive. Babel, Babylon. Well, Babylon pops up again in the last book in the Bible, as you know. Chapter 6, of course, is Daniel in the lion's den. We're now under another king, another empire, another emperor. We're under Darius. And now, once again, there are problems. There's anti-Semitism once again. People are forced to worship the God the emperor wants them to, and people are forbidden to pray to any other god for a period of a month. But Daniel's not going to be deterred. And he always had a habit of praying towards Jerusalem with an open window, looking far to the west, to where God's dwelling place had been. And he went up to his bedroom window as usual. You know the rest of the story. And it says an angel shut the lions' mouths. Takes an angel to hold a lion's mouth shut. And he was delivered again. And Darius had to swallow his words. Daniel just went on and on and on, no matter who came or conquered. Daniel was a man whose quality and whose integrity everybody recognized, and therefore wanted to make responsible and give high office to. It's a wonderful model and example for young men, to be the kind of young men whom unbelievers, pagans, will use because they recognize integrity and quality of character. Well, that's just the first 6 chapters, and we'll make a break there. When we come to the second half of Daniel, we're in a totally different atmosphere. Daniel 1 to 6 is very easy to understand. Daniel 7 to 12 are very difficult. We move from the simple to the complicated. We move from the third person to the first person, remember. From now on, it's I, Daniel. He's writing himself and about his visions of the future. We are switching from most of it being Aramaic to most of it being Hebrew. Therefore, we're moving into a section that is primarily for God's people. And certainly I wouldn't throw Daniel 7 to 12 at an unbeliever. I think they'd think we were all crazy. We're moving from Daniel's present life to his future insights. And he makes unique predictions so detailed and so dated in sequence and so accurate in the light of historical events that it's simply history written down before it happened. It is the most extraordinary example, these chapters, of history written before it happens, which faces us with this implication, with 2 implications. First, that the future is known by God, that he knows the future as well as the past. Mind you, he can't change the past. Even God can't do that. But he can change the future, but the future is known to him. He can see ahead. He knows how many birthdays you're going to have before you die. That's in Psalm 139. God has counted them before you were born. That's God. Man can't know that, but God can and does. Not only is the future known by God, but the future is shaped by God. That doesn't mean that everything is predetermined and planned. That's fatalism. There's a very delicate balance in Scripture here. We shall find a statement in the book of Esther when we come to it. A statement by Mordecai to Esther, who knows if you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this. But he says to Esther, you can either fulfill God's plan, or if you don't, somebody else will. And take Judas Iscariot. He wasn't predestined to betray Jesus. It was inevitable that someone would, and Jesus himself said, the Son of Man must be betrayed, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. Got to be careful to keep a balance between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. It isn't that everything's predetermined, but God doesn't foreknow things, and he does have the most free will. He's got far more than we have, and he can shape events. I tend to think of a chess player. if I was playing against a master chess player, a champion, he would win, but I would be free to make it the moves I wanted to make. But every move I make, he can match, and he can still win. There's a flexibility in God's sovereignty that we really must hold very precious, lest we slip into what is virtually Islam, which is a kind of predetermined predestination. You can't do anything about it. So it's not fatalism, but nevertheless there is a divine sovereignty that not only knows the future, but can shape it. And whatever moves we make, God can make sure that he brings about what he wants to bring about. So that's what makes prophecy possible. Now, when we look at the number of visions of the future in Daniel 7 to 12, I've got to explain something or you will be confused. Maybe looking at that board, you think, boy, am I confused, like the American student who had B-A-I-K on his sweatshirt. And they said, what does that mean? He said, boy, am I confused. And they said, you don't spell confused with a K, you spell it with a C. He said, boy, you don't know how confused I am. So let's try and sort this out. The first thing to get hold of is that chapters 7 to 12 are not continuous. They're not a straight line of visions of future events that follow each other all the way through. That's the first thing. Well, now that's simple, but get that in your head. So when you read through chapters 7 to 12, you're not reading a straight history of the future. They are separate visions of the future. Nor, secondly, are they consecutive. You can't say that the vision of chapter 8 follows chapter 7 and 9 follows 8. They're mixed up. So it's not as straightforward as we might think. Nor, thirdly, are they coterminous. The separate visions do not start at the same point, and they don't finish at the same point, which again confuses people when they read. In other words, we've got to read each vision separately and then fit it in to where it fits in. So they're not continuous in one straight continuous line. They're not even consecutive, following one after another. And they don't start at the same point, they don't finish the same point. Now, having told you what they're not, let's tell you what they are. First of all, they do vary in duration. Some of the visions are about a very short part of the future, and some are about a much longer part. Then another may be of quite a short part, and another may be of a very long part, so that they vary in the length of time they cover. So you can't just fit them all together easily. Do you follow me? And then they do overlap. So you might have a long vision covering a large bit of the future and a shorter vision which follows, which overlaps that and gives it in more detail. So there's quite a bit of overlap between. Now comes the really complicated bit, as if you're not already bamboozled. They do cover two periods which both end together. What I mean is, they cover a period before Christ and a period after Christ, what we call BC AD. But in both cases, the visions of this period end with the coming of Christ, and the visions of this period are about the final days coming up to the end of history. So the visions are concerned with what is popularly called the end times, but both the BC end times and the AD end times. So looking through his telescope, he sees two periods and didn't realize the gap between. Do you remember when we looked at Isaiah? There was a gap between. It's as if he looked through his telescope of prophecy and saw two mountain peaks, one in front of the other, one lower in front and the higher one behind, and did not realize how much there was in between the two peaks. Well, he couldn't see it. When you're looking through a telescope at two peaks, one in front of another, you can't see anything that is hidden by the first peak. Do you follow me? So let's look at this sort of diagram here. He can see everything leading up to the first peak, but he can only see the last little bit leading up to the second. Do you follow me there? So he can see from his own day, I'm now translating this into time, He can see from his own day, and his prophecies begin just 6 years after his death, and he can see right up to the coming of Christ. But he can't see anything after the first coming of Christ, but he can see the last little bit of the second coming. The events leading up to the second coming. Like most Old Testament prophets, he didn't realize how much there was between these two peaks. He saw it all as the one thing coming, and he called it the kingdom. And he didn't realize that the kingdom will come in 2 stages, because the king comes twice. And we now understand that, but they didn't see it. And you can see that looking ahead, he saw everything leading up to the end of BC, and the last little bit to the end of AD. So we have, in fact, the events predicted which lead up to the first coming of the king, and the events leading up to the second coming of the king. And the astonishing thing is that both series of events are almost identical. For example, to rush ahead, there is a real baddie appears in both periods. In the first period, it was a man called Antiochus Epiphanes, and in the second period, it is the Antichrist. And those two are remarkably similar. In other words, as we study the events that lead up to the first coming of Christ, you get an insight into the events leading up to the second coming of Christ. You with me so far? A bit complicated all this, but I'm trying to unravel it so that when you read it, you can really study it carefully and fit it all in together. So history is divided into BC and AD. Actually, the Jews don't like the letters AD, Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord, so they use the letters CE, Common Era, which means common to Jews and Christians. So they say BC and CE, or actually they call this BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. But we call it before Christ and Anno Domini, BC and AD, because his first coming split history in 2, and his second coming ends history, so that we see this much better. So again, all that's a bit complicated, but I think it will help you just to think straight as we go further into the actual things. Let's go straight on to this next chart, and then we'll work through it. You see, what he saw in the vision, what Nebuchadnezzar's first dream in chapter 2 was all about, was that there would be a series of human kingdoms of decreasing quality. From the golden king, the head, through the silver, down through the iron to the feet of clay. A series of human kingdoms that would lead up to the inauguration of the divine kingdom. And so we have the Babylonian, the Persians and the Medes, the Greeks and the Romans. And the king came during the last Roman Empire. Now then, he expected the divine kingdom completely to take over from the human kingdoms. He didn't realize that the divine kingdom would go through a period in which it was on earth alongside other human kingdoms. He was seeing this second peak as almost part of the first. Didn't realize that there was a gap. We live in that gap, and we live in the divine kingdom, and yet there are still human kingdoms and empires and powers, Russia, China, America. One day there will only be one kingdom. But there's this overlap which Daniel didn't see. Do you remember the vision? Let's go back to it, of that giant. Forget this bit for a moment. Here's the colossus that he dreamt about, Nebuchadnezzar. And he saw that whole giant come tumbling down because he saw a rock from a mountain, a rock that hadn't been touched by man, a rock that hadn't been carved. This rock struck the Colossus at the feet and the whole thing collapsed. And this rock he saw as the kingdom of God, breaking in on human kingdoms, replacing them all, sending them all tumbling, and establishing God's divine kingdom in its place. Now, he thought that would happen all at once. We know it's happening in 2 stages, and that the kingdoms of this world have continued alongside the divine kingdom. So how would we best tackle all this? I think if I went through all the predictions that have already happened and then looked at those that haven't. In other words, let's look at all the predictions leading up to the first coming of Christ that have happened in incredible detail according to Daniel's predictions, even to how long it would be between when he said it and when the king would come. He even told us that, to the year. Quite an astonishing feat. Remembering that we live in this gap, so that these things are all passed to us and we can check up. The predictions are already fulfilled. First of all, the prediction in chapter 2, that Colossus again, well, Babylon was followed by the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were followed by Greece, and the Greeks were followed by the Romans. That has all happened and come exactly true. Nebuchadnezzar's dream has come true, and Daniel's interpretation of it came true. That's in chapter 2. In chapter 8, we have this ram and this goat. And that again has all happened. We have a ram and a goat with one horn, and chapter 8 talks about these two. Now, it's very obvious that they correspond to 2 parts of the Colossus, the giant. They correspond to the Medes-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. And whatever is said about the ram and the goat in chapter 8 have all come true. For example, talks about the Persian Empire, and that was a big empire. It stretched from India down to Egypt. The whole of Turkey was in it. That whole area became the empire of the Persians. And it's now, of course, Iran and the Ayatollah. Do you remember the Shah of Persia had a huge festival to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire? And he rebuilt the whole thing and had a tent, and all parts of our royal family went to that and were celebrating. And the Shah of Persia gave himself a new title on that 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. Do you know what his title was? King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now you can check me up. I preached at that time that the Shah had finished himself off, that nobody could give themselves that title and survive. And within a very, very short period, the Shah was gone. You don't get away with things. God is still in control of history, you know. God is to be feared. But everything that chapter 8 says about the ram, the Persian Empire, came true. You can read all about it. Don't need to go into the details. The Greek Empire that followed the goat, Alexander the Great. Do you know his nickname was the goat? Because he was forever charging. I mean, the man was 31 when he died, and he'd conquered the world. This man charged around like a he-goat, butting everybody out of the way. The polite followers called him Alexander the Great, but the impolite called him Alexander the Goat. And Daniel foresaw it all. Isn't it amazing? And that's where the Greek Empire was. Now, when Alexander the Great died at the very young age of 31, you study it, it was because he was a self-indulgent man as well. And it was his sins too that contributed to his downfall. When he died, his empire was divided between his 4 generals. I've put the letters there. First of all, there was I don't know how to say this. Lysimachus, can anybody correct me there? I think it's Lysimachus, he got Turkey. Cassander, he got Greece. And then Ptolemy, Ptolemy, you've heard of the Ptolemies? He got Egypt. And Seleucus got this bit. And you realize that Israel was trapped between Seleucus and Ptolemy. Chapter 11 is all about the kings of the north and the south. And this is the north and this is the south. It's the Seleucids and the Ptolemies that really became the pressures on little Israel. And this is where you get perhaps the most astonishing prediction of all. But no, I've got one more before I come to it. So the Greek Empire divided into 4. Daniel saw it all. And then said the real problem for God's people here would be between these two. And in fact, they had no problems from those two. They were trapped between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Now, the next chapter, chapter 9, contains this amazing prediction of how long it would be before the king arrived. Daniel, 70 weeks. But of course, a week, the word for week in Hebrew is the same as the word for 7. 70 sevens. Really isn't 70 weeks at all, it's 70 sevens. That's 490. And he said, from the decree to go back from Babylon to Jerusalem to the coming of the king would be 490 years. 70 sevens. Now, we have a little problem here. Which decree is he referring to? Because there were actually 4. There was the decree of Cyrus, which began the return. That was in 536. Then Darius made a decree allowing more of them to go back. And Artaxerxes made 2 decrees which enabled Nehemiah to go and rebuild. Now, which decree do we count it from? Whichever you count it from, it either brings us to the birth of Jesus or his baptism. It is astonishing. Now, of course, we have also another problem. Was Daniel using the solar year of 365 and a quarter days, or the lunar year of 360 days? Was he following the Babylonian calendar or the Jewish calendar? There's a whole lot of literature trying to argue what he was using. The fact is that just under 500 years later, Jesus was here. That's near enough for me. All the details I just can't quite work out because of all the astronomical problems involved, but it's near enough. And in fact, one decree would bring us to the birth of Jesus and the other to his baptism. Either way, the king had come. Isn't that astonishing to have said that? 500 years before it happened. And he was right. And the king had come. Again, you must get hold of commentaries to get all the details if you want it. So, you see what we're saying? The Colossus in chapter 2, the vision covers from there to there. Forget chapter 7 for a moment. The ram and the goat in chapter 8 cover from there to there. See what I meant by overlapping? The 70 weeks, actually they're divided, not just 70, 62, sorry, start again. 7 sevens first, that's 49. And then you've got 62 sevens, and then 1 left over. So 7 sevens, 49, 62, 434. Add those together, 483. I shouldn't have said 490, 483, right? Now, why did he divide that? Because that was the exact time it took to rebuild Jerusalem. So he said those weeks will cover Jerusalem. Then, after Jerusalem is completely built, it will be so long until the end of the 69th seven. And then the king will come. Then he left the 70th week. We're going to look at that. Because I believe in the 70th week, he was looking right past this peak and he saw this peak. And there was a huge gap between the 69th seven and the 70th seven. But again, read the commentaries if you want to see all this. Now, chapter 10. Chapter 10 covers this period and gives a remarkable insight into the fact that all earthly conflicts are matched by a heavenly conflict going on between demonic forces that are behind earthly kingdoms. Now there's a remarkable insight in Daniel which too many Christians today are making too much of. I'll come back to that in a moment. Behind every earthly power, every growing kingdom, there is a demonic prince. There's a demon behind people that want to take over other countries. My, you find that easy to believe by looking at Czechoslovakia today, don't you? There's something demonic about the way they're destroying their own land. But you see, a demonic power is destructive and doesn't care what they do as long as we become powerful. It takes men over. And we're told in that chapter 10 about the Persian prince and the Greek prince, and how God sends Michael to overcome them and deal with them. This is spiritual warfare. This really is. The demons up there, the princes, the evil angels, fallen angels, demonic powers behind all the battles that go on down here. Earthly battles are a reflection of a spiritual battle that's going on up there. That's the unique insight in Daniel chapter 10. I just want you to notice that Daniel isn't involved in that battle. It is left entirely to the angels. I'm afraid too many Christians are building a whole strategy on just 2 verses in Daniel 10. I'm sure you've come across it. It's called spiritual warfare. And before you have an evangelistic campaign, you must identify the evil demon over the city and bind him before you can start preaching the gospel. Listen, I think that is really wrong and a distraction from our job. Jesus did not say, go into all the nations, find the demon and bind him. He said, go and make disciples of all the nations. Now, I'm afraid this is a big issue now, and I would be a bit unpopular in some circles for saying this, but spiritual warfare, leave that to the angels until they make themselves manifest. I noticed that Jesus and the apostles never went looking for demons. But when a demon came and attacked them, they dealt with it. And I believe that's the model for us. Not to go looking for demons and trying to bind them, but to get on with our job of making disciples for the kingdom. And if demons do manifest themselves, then deal with them in the name of Jesus. Paul was so patient with one that he waited 3 days before he cast the demon out of a girl that was messing up their meetings. Don't get involved in spiritual warfare unless demons manifest themselves to you. Then tackle them in the name of Jesus. We have another task, and that's to get on with spreading the good news of the kingdom. Daniel, it happened while he was praying, and God showed him while he prayed that that was going on up there, but that God was dealing with that with other angels. And Daniel was to get on with his job down here. It's just an insight we need to have. And again, you can exaggerate Ephesians 6. It's true we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers in heavenly places. But wrestle means they attack you first. Don't go looking for them. And we can get quite distracted if we get too involved in this. But it's an insight that we need to have, that all the struggles down here are in a sense an overflow from a struggle that's going on in heavenly places between the forces of light and darkness. Daniel was allowed to see that, but God told him, I'm dealing with it. Leave that one to me. You get on with your job down there. I just throw that in because I'm afraid Daniel 10 has become almost a proof text for what's now called spiritual warfare. Now we come to chapter 11. Chapter 11 just covers, where are we, a little bit of here. And I think chapter 11 is the most astonishing prediction of the future in the whole Bible. In 35 verses, there are 135 major events predicted. And it is so astonishing, I've given you a sheet of paper, both sides, and taken you through just 35 verses. No point in looking at it now. It's forbidding just to look at it. But take it home. And if ever you wonder about the predictions of the Bible, take out that sheet and read it. It is only about a tiny section of history just before the king came the first time. And in just 35 verses, 135 major events are described in detail. Now, liberal scholars just cannot handle this chapter. They say Daniel couldn't possibly have written it. It must have been written 400 years later. But God knows the beginning and the end from the beginning. And God enabled Daniel to write it. I've put that out. You may find it interesting, you may not. But if ever you wanted proof of prophecy, the fulfillments of this one chapter, it is the record in the whole Bible. There is no other book in the Bible, no other chapter in the Bible that contains such an incredible concentration of predictions about the future. You see, I told you that in the whole Bible there are 735 predictions. Well, 135 of them are in 35 verses in Daniel 11. Isn't that incredible? Well, it's a big test of whether you're a believer or not to read a chapter like that. Chapter 12 is entirely concerned with this second group of events leading up to the second coming. Now, all that is what has been fulfilled in the past, but there is one more thing I want to talk about. In chapter 11, I want to talk about that man. That's the Antichrist of BC. That's the only likeness we have of this dreadful man, Antiochus Epiphanes. And he is predicted in chapter 11 as the greatest scourge against the Jewish people before the king comes. And Antiochus Epiphanes' name among Jewish people, terrible. Hardly like to talk about what he did. He became actually the regent in the Seleucid part of the Greek Empire, just north of Israel. And he was the guardian of a young boy who was in fact the king, but he killed the boy and took over the throne as king. The worst tyrant of all, he determined to wipe out the Jewish religion. He desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. He filled the temple rooms with prostitutes. I mean, he could hardly have done more. He erected the image of Jupiter in the temple at Jerusalem. This was what caused the Maccabean revolt. If ever you've read that bit of history, the Maccabean revolt came about through this man. And he is, in a sense, the parallel to the Antichrist at the end of history. They belong together. The one foreshadows the other. And if you want to know about Antichrist, read about this man. Let's just look quickly at the predictions that are not yet fulfilled. Remember the uncut stone from the mountain that caused the human colossus to fall and the human empires to collapse and replace them? That has not yet happened. Even though the king has been once, he hasn't yet taken over the kingdoms of the world. He will at the second time. Then there's chapter 7. And chapter 7 contains some extraordinary things. And I believe you see, some people try and line up chapter 7 with chapter 2. That's why I've put a dotted line and say that the 4 strange beasts of chapter 7 are the same as the 4 empires in chapter 2 in the giant. I don't think that fits at all. And there are many reasons why, and I haven't time to go into all of them. But in chapter 7, we have a picture of 4 strange beasts, a lion with wings, followed by a big bear, followed by a leopard with wings and 4 heads, followed by what I can only describe as a griffin or a dragon, followed by a kingdom in which God's kingdom is established on earth by a figure like a son of man coming on the clouds to reign with the saints of the Most High. Now that certainly hasn't happened yet. I believe we've got here a lead-in to the second coming of Christ. And if you ask me, well, what are the four beasts? They just do not fit the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. They just don't fit when you check out. There are so many anomalies. One is, for example, that these three will still be around when this one appears. Though it is this one that is dealt the death blow to allow the kingdom of God to be established. I'm going to speculate here, and it is speculation. I don't want you to take it as any more than that. What does a lion with wings communicate to you? These are world powers at the end of history. America and UK. What does the bear communicate to you? Russia. What does a leopard communicate to you? The Arab world. I may be wrong, but if I'm right, then these three will still be around right at the end, but will be replaced by this. And I suppose one of the most astonishing things that people are asking me about today is the fact of Saddam Hussein rebuilding Babylon. Here is the program cover from the big festival he held there with Nebuchadnezzar and Saddam Hussein side by side. And he compares his profile and says, you see, there was a laser light show at Babylon and the face of Nebuchadnezzar and Saddam Hussein were projected onto the clouds. Here are the ruins of Babylon as they are, and here they are being rebuilt today. There's the Gate of Ishtar completed. And Saddam has even dressed his soldiers in the old Nebuchadnezzar helmets and tunics and sandals, except this guy brought sneakers. But there it is. And here are the new walls of Babylon rising over the ruins, all being reconstructed. Now, I'm not going any nearer than that. I'm just saying the whole thing has become incredible again. And events are happening with such speed, we need to keep our eyes open. But here we have in chapter 7, I believe, the last world powers giving way to the Antichrist and the final coming of the kingdom, the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory to deal with Antichrist, to take over the kingdoms of the world so that they may become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. All this is there. And the 70th week here. That 70th week, when you study it, is a week full of trouble. It's divided into 3.5 weeks, down the middle. It's very interesting that even the book of Revelation picks that up, 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years, the time of big trouble. Well, we haven't time to go into all the differences of opinion about these things, but Daniel, I believe, saw it all, and saw the first coming and the second. And in chapter 12, which is entirely future, he talks of the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked, and the righteous shining like stars forever. It's the final climax. When it all happens, we shall all know very clearly. Why was all this revealed to Daniel for the future? I believe primarily as an encouragement to God's people. And throughout these chapters, God's people are encouraged to stand firm, to do exploits, to bring understanding, to endure suffering, to be refined, to resist evil, and to find rest. Those are very interesting reasons for revealing the future. God hasn't told us the whole future, but he's told us enough of the future for us to be able to do those things. Shall I run through them again? We know enough about the future to stand firm, to do exploits, to bring understanding, to endure suffering, to be refined, to resist evil, and to find rest. Now you see, some people just want to know the future out of sheer curiosity. to be in the know, you know, to have it all tied up. And I get lots of questions about this. People who just seem to want to get all the details tied up. I believe the essential reason for God revealing the future to us is so that we can handle it properly, so that we can be ready, so that we can stand firm and do what God wants us to do and endure suffering, knowing that the end will be glorious. The other reason, of course, I believe it is a warning to unbelievers, especially to those who want to build human empires, want to be powerful people. Ultimately, the Son of Man will replace them all. We belong to the future King of the whole world. And the Son of Man will come in clouds of glory and establish the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And we shall reign with him. Great emphasis on get ready to reign. He's going to reign with the saints of the Most High. We know who the Son of Man is. We know who the saints are. You're going to run the world with Jesus. You better get ready to be good, responsible governors of the world with him. Amen.